Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. I'm delighted and honoured to be joined by Dr. Alice Boyes. Alice is a former clinical psychologist and researcher turned writer. She's got a PhD in the psychology of relationships, and having turned into a writer, she's author of 2 best-selling books, The Anxiety Toolkit, that she released in 2015, and most recently the Healthy Mind Toolkit, which she released this year. Now, the Anxiety Toolkit did really well. The ebook version of that book made it to Wall Street Journal bestseller list. So I know that sold a lot of books. Mine certainly didn't make the Wall Street Journal. And recently the Healthy Mind Toolkit. Am I right, Alice, in saying that Oprah is a big fan of your work, that some of this stuff is on her website?
That big fan might be exaggerating, but they did post an excerpt, a pretty long excerpt from the Anxiety Toolkit on the Oprah.com website. So if you Google my name and Oprah.com, you'll come up with a pretty significant chunk from the Anxiety Toolkit, which is a good read to see if the rest of the book is going to be something that is of interest to you.
Fantastic. And I'm right in saying that you've left clinical psychology behind. You're not a practitioner anymore or a researcher, and you're just purely writing, whether it's books, and you've got a blog on Psychology Today where you've had over 11 million views, so you've had loads of views there, and it's just purely writing for you now.
Yeah, I have a lot of other I have my fingers in a lot of other pies, but in terms of psychology, yes, I no longer practice psychology, and I've turned my hand to writing since 2013.
Brilliant. Now, Alice, I've been following you on Twitter for some time and follow quite a few psychologists, and I love to look at the little tweets with relation to various articles that you might retweet or write yourself, and that turned me on to your latest book, The Healthy Mind Toolkit, and it really resonated with me, and it certainly resonates, I think, in the world of sport. And just to say to our audience, I'm really excited because Alice is kind of the first non-sporting person on the Sports Psych Show, which I just think is so important because it's something we really lack in our industry. We're too busy talking to sports coaches and sports psychologists, but actually most of our work comes from mainstream psychology, so it's fantastic to have Alice on. And your book, Alice, really resonated with me, The Healthy Mind Toolkit, because it's predominantly about self-sabotaging. And sports people, sports coaches do tend to self-sabotage. And I just wanted to start, having read your book and running through a list of the kind of self-sabotaging you might have. I just wrote down in preparation for this podcast some of this self-sabotaging I probably experienced in my career as a professional golfer, and also the self-sabotaging I experienced working with, whether it's some of the best sports competitors in the world right down to young competitors, and some of these might resonate with you, and I'll, if it's okay, get you to comment afterwards. So things I hear every day are not enough structure, too much structure, prone to giving up, persisting with the wrong approach, reflecting too much, that's a massive one, and then not reflecting at all, that's another massive one. Being engaged in perfectionism, that's huge in sport, and then the opposite of that would be taking too laissez-faire approach, being rigid, having a rigid view of self, and then too little understanding of self, being too pessimistic, being overly optimistic, blaming others. The opposite would be taking too much responsibility. Don't use time effectively, have no downtime. You know what, I've got a whole pile more, but I'm conscious of going on and on. But this is what happens in sport, Alice. And this is self-sabotage, isn't it? And really what I want to get under the skin of is, what is self-sabotage and why do people experience it?
Yeah, so the book takes a very broad view of the idea of self-sabotage. So it's really anything that you to do that where you're getting in your own way. And you mentioned all of those patterns that are kind of the opposite of each other. And the real trap for people is often our our strengths and our weaknesses are kind of one and the same. So if we have any extreme trait, it tends to be both a strength and a weakness. So if you're a perfectionist, that trait will be a strength for you in some respects, but then it will also have a dark side to it. Another example would be being very persistent. So that's something that I find about myself. I'm extremely persistent with things, and that's something that's very useful and generally has helped with my success and stuff. But it also means that I can persist with things that are not very important for too long. So I can kind of go down the rabbit hole of working on something when I should actually be prioritizing something else. So one of the things for people to realize is that whatever your extreme qualities are, those are the things that probably help you succeed, but they're also probably the things that trip you up. And you want to be able to be flexible about when you apply certain qualities to a task. So does a task or an activity suit a perfectionistic approach, or does it suit another approach, and that type of thing?
Absolutely, and that again really resonates in the world of sport. For my own sport, golf, so many golfers are renowned for being perfectionists, and as you allude to there, Alice, one of the reasons they get to the level they get to is because of their perfectionism in many ways. The endless hours they might spend practicing, honing their game. If you think of tennis players, whether it's Andy Murray or Rafa Nadal or Roger Federer, they will spend hours honing their game. They'll be in the gym for hours. They'll be doing what could be perceived as all the right things. They'd be analysing their game. But equally, that form of perfectionism, as you're alluding to, the downside of it is that they can become over-emotional when things aren't going so well, when things aren't working. And I just think it's a really, really interesting take on sort of personality traits, if that's the right term to use. That your strengths can be your weakness, and your weakness can be your strength. Do you think, from your work, most people see it that way? Do you think they're quite aware of their strengths and how those strengths can be a weakness as well? Or do you think people are sort of blind to that?
I think people are aware of it when you say it. So I think people really recognise it very quickly when it's pointed out, but they don't necessarily go through their life thinking about it. I think there's a lot of I guess media and social media where it might be, especially if people will say, well, perfectionism is bad, and then people look at themselves and their own experiences and can say, well, hey, like this good things happened to me because I was a perfectionist and because I worked harder than everyone else. This good thing happened to me. This good thing happened to me. And then they try and balance that against maybe things that they're reading, say that overworking is bad for you, or stress is bad for you, or perfectionism is bad for you, and that doesn't kind of resonate with their own experience. And so if you see it in the way I described, where you see that your extreme traits are both strengths and weaknesses, or tend to be both strengths and weaknesses, you can understand and reconcile the different experiences you have a wee bit better, and learn to look out for situations in which something that's generally a strength for you might be kind of working against you.
So it sounds to me like a crucial skill in your ability to deal with self-sabotaging is becoming self-aware, being aware of the thoughts, the feelings you experience, the behaviours you're engaging in. That's your kind of entry point to be able to manage those self-sabotaging behaviours.
Yeah, it's kind of being aware of the habitual ways that you tend to approach problems. So it's, there's that saying that people say, if all you've got is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. Like if the only approach that you have to problem solving is is overworking or is perfectionism, then you're going to apply that to every problem that you face, and it might work well for 50% or 80% of the problems that you're dealing with, but then for other situations maybe you need to step back more and get more perspective, or maybe you're ending up with overuse related injuries or those kinds of things where it's actually not working for you to just keep going, keep persisting with something.
Yeah, it's. I think that self-awareness piece is so challenging. Do you find people, when you used to work as a psychologist, going back a couple of years ago, did you find that some people found it difficult to be self-aware, that they weren't necessarily aware of their inner world? I ask that because I find that sometimes in my work with athletes, sports participants, I find those players, competitors, some of the most challenging to work with because they don't necessarily have the meta skill. By that I mean they're thinking about their thinking. They haven't necessarily, the type of person they are, they don't necessarily engage in deep reflection about their inner world. Did you find that in your work?
I think that the clients that I used to tend to get were all people that had an interest in their inner world. So I mostly worked with clients with anxiety who were very, very aware of their inner world because they were worrying excessively and ruminating about how other people thought about them and ruminating about mistakes that they'd made and things. So I think certainly the client group that I had was very heavily orientated toward that type of person, where people were very aware of their inner world and got caught up in traps of overthinking.
I suppose the other challenging area I find is when players, again competitors from the sporting world, are really slave to their thoughts and feelings, and they find it enormously difficult to shift thoughts. Historically, your approach, whether being a practitioner or now being a writer, is cognitive behavioural therapy. So what does that actually mean? Cognitive behavioural therapy is CBT. What form does that approach take?
Yeah, so what I do in my writing is, so I used to practice cognitive behavioural therapy with some other approaches kind of mixed in. So there are approaches that they call the mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches. So with sprinkles of that. And now what I do is I write about applying the principles that come from cognitive behavioural therapy to non-clinical problems. Not necessarily using the same techniques, but taking the principles from those fields, and instead of having all that knowledge kind of locked up in the therapy clinic and only having only applying to problems like depression or anxiety disorders, looking at how we can use those same principles for dealing with everyday stress and all sorts of everyday problems that people account for. And all it really means is understanding how your thoughts, behaviour, feelings and triggers are linked, and also how your physical body in there as well. So how the impact that stress might be having on things like pain or sleep or those kinds of things, and then conversely how pain might be affecting you physically, like how it might be reducing your threshold for dealing with irritability and all of those kinds of things. So understanding how all of those factors are linked together. And
how would you describe the link between thinking and behaviour, thinking and action? Is there a clear link there? Is that easy to describe, or is there a general complexity to that?
Yep, no, it's actually very easy to describe. That's an awesome question. So the real take-home message to remember is that people more easily think about the link from thinking to behaviour rather than the link back from behaviour to thinking. So people will say, when I've got more energy, I will exercise more, or when I feel more confident, then I'll take a dance class. They're expecting that their thinking will change first, and when their thinking changes, or when their emotions change, or something changes about their physical energy levels, or that kind of thing, that will impact their behaviour. When the general evidence is that although it's like a bi-directional relationship, although it works in both directions, that the link from behaviour back to thinking is actually stronger. So the best way to change thoughts and feelings is to change behaviour. So if you want to feel more confident, take a dance class rather than waiting for your thoughts or feelings to change first. If you want to have more energy, and you don't currently exercise, do more exercise. So that's the easiest way to influence thoughts and feelings is through behaviour, basically.
This is exactly why I wanted non-sports coaches or psychs on this podcast, because I think what you've just said there is so, even though you might not realise it, it's so profound and so impactful for the sporting world. That notion of the bi-directional relationship between behaviour and thinking and behaviour, because I think sports psychology is known for, if a sports psychologist comes into this soccer club, baseball club, or whatever sport it might be, and helps change my athlete's thoughts and feelings, and so subsequently they can play better. But I'm often speaking with coaches and describing confidence in terms of action, in terms of behaviour, and quite often I'm saying, let's take a soccer player. I'll be saying to a coach, well, just insist on that soccer player. If that soccer player is low in confidence, if that footballer has had a few weeks where they're not playing so good and they're low in confidence, and they've stated that, just insist on them passing a football with confidence, looking confident, acting confident, and that can have an enormous impact. It almost switches their attention onto something positive, pragmatic that they can do, away from perhaps resonating the negatives, and that change of behaviour and insistence of a different behaviour impacts the thoughts and feelings of the player.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of evidence and even simple things that people can just try to see that for themselves. So people can try the half smile technique, where if you a fake half smile, it activates the same sort of muscles in your face as doing a real genuine smile. And so if you do a fake half smile, you'll often feel happier, whereas if you do a big fake smile, it activates different muscles from a real smile, and it doesn't work. So anyone can just try that, just sitting here right now. It's just doing a tiny wee fake half smile and seeing if they feel a little bit better. And then also there's evidence with things like just standing up straighter, and that people feel more confident when they stand up straighter, or people feel more confident when they put on a white coat that makes them look like a doctor, or those kinds of things. And I think sometimes people talk about, if you're for going to the gym and stuff, sometimes it's good to put on the actual athletic gear rather than just go in your grungy shorts and grungy t-shirt, if you want to maybe be a bit more focused, if you want, and that kind of thing, because that it does make a difference. And those are simple self-experiments that people can try to see whether it makes a difference. For you to rely on anyone else telling you, you can easily try it out for yourself.
Absolutely. When you use your examples, when you talk about your examples there, I think of thumbs up and things like that, and as you alluded, standing tall. For sports competitors, it's often, just deliberately and on purpose getting onto their toes and acting sharp and acting lively, and that helps them stay switched on, and it helps them have a better chance to play with confidence. If we're looking at it from the other direction, Alice, and we're coming in from a sort of a cognitive, a thinking perspective, what kind of tools and techniques would you recommend there? So instead of shifting thinking from a behavioural perspective, but shifting thinking from a proactively shifting your thoughts perspective?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what your thinking biases are.
Okay.
But I guess I'd go back to what I said a wee bit earlier about recognising your typical ways of approaching something and assessing whether that's the right tool for a particular situation. So, do I need to overwork in this particular situation, or is what I need to do take a step back? And people get very, for example, people who are workaholics, whether that's to do with a traditional job or whether that's to do with sport or any other field that you might be a workaholic in, that people feel and they're stuck in that pattern. They feel very anxious, and they feel like if they do that, if they do take a step back or take a small break or change something about their typical way of operating, that they're just going to spontaneously combust with anxiety over having done that. Like, there's some catastrophe that's going to happen if they do that. But people learn from actually doing it that that doesn't happen, that the sky doesn't fall in, and that taking that wee break might allow them to get some perspective, or might allow them healing, or whatever else it is. So yeah, that would be one thing I would say, would be to just know your typical patterns. There are lots of other ways that it might manifest, and you really have to know what's the problem for you. Like, it might be somebody who is unconfident, and there's something that they need to speak up about. There's something that they're not comfortable about. Like, maybe it's a particular way that someone's training them that doesn't seem to be working for them. But they think it's actually harmful to them physically, or that they feel nervous to speak up. Maybe they think they don't want to be perceived as fussy, or they don't want to be perceived as anything negative, or they think, other people must know best. So, perhaps about yourself that you have a hard time speaking up about things that you'd like to speak up about, that you tend to ignore that instinct. And once you kind of know that you have that pattern, then you can look out for times when that when that pattern might be cropping up, and be on the lookout for that, and look at some alternative behaviours.
So what I hear you saying is, again, it starts with that self-awareness piece, and that's my term, I know, but it starts with self-awareness, and then it kind of moves on to a bit of self-regulation. And I almost hear this idea of arguing with yourself, perhaps. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but debating with yourself internally about what you're doing and what you're experiencing, and for instance with the working hard. And that's a really common thing, especially in elite sport, or in sort of youth developing sport, in as much as young sports competitors will overwork because they think they have to, and they cause themselves an injury and problems from there. So what I think I hear you say from a self-regulation perspective, this notion of, well, stop, hold on. The world isn't going to fall in if I take a break here, and actually there's benefits to taking a break. So kind of arguing against yourself and striving to find the benefits or the positives in the opposite behaviours that you kind of automatically or habitually want to engage in.
Yeah, because if you're someone that tends to overwork, or you tend to be a perfectionist, or those kinds of things, you're already good at that. What you're not good at is the other side. So what's actually harder for you is doing the opposite thing. And we all tend to do what comes easy to us, and so it's paradoxically harder to step back than it is to keep overworking, or it might be something about changing your approach. We will often feel most comfortable by just continuing to do what we've always done, and sometimes it's about stepping back and realizing that you need to maybe not accept someone else's view of the way something needs to be done, or something that might be the only option. So you mentioned people think that they have to devote their life to something and have no kind of life outside of their sport, or maybe it's someone who's starting a business and they think, if I'm going to have a startup, if I'm going to have a tech startup or whatever it is, I've got no choice but to have no life. That's the only way to do this. And any thought that you have that has a must or a have to in it, or a should, those are all thoughts where you want to really step back and evaluate whether you've got tunnel vision, and whether those thoughts are really true, and if those thoughts are really helpful.
Do you think we tend to get into those stuck patterns of language? I always use that term. I mean, some of the things you're saying there, the must, the shoulds, it reminds me of, or stems, that even does stem from the work of Dr. Albert Ellis, a pioneer of REBT, rational motive behaviour therapy, which I've spoken about on this podcast before. Do you think we all have a tendency to get stuck in those patterns of language? That I really like the term you use there, tunnel vision. It closes down our awareness of what's around us, other options, alternative options, and we get stuck, and we've kind of got to argue our way out to increase our horizons, either externally or internally.
Yeah, and it can happen on sort of like a broader level as well. Like you always hear about those kind of paradigm shifts in different areas, which includes sports, where everyone's always done it one way for like a super long time, and then someone proposes a different way. Like maybe it's a different way of designing a piece of equipment. Like maybe it's a different kind of bike design for a cyclist, or a different kind of part of something different in a America's Cup yacht or something like that. And so we get tunnel vision about all sorts of aspects of our own behaviour, and whether that's the way we train, or the way that equipment is designed, or all of those kinds of things. So it happens on a personal level, but also on like a kind of more a larger scale level within a sport.
Just going back to your first book, so we talked a lot about self-sabotage, which, as I alluded to, is huge in sport and really holds players, competitors, participants back. Your first book on anxiety, again, we could probably talk for hours about that, but just in the sort of final 10 or 15 minutes, I'd just like to cover that briefly. Anxiety, in sport, we would really target. We would hone in on this notion of performance anxiety. So perhaps in your world you may have helped somebody deal with the anxiety of having to present, the anxiety of having a meeting in the workplace. And they really do parallel the sports world. That's having to present in front of a group of people, or having to hold a meeting with your boss and colleagues, is exactly like having to go out on the golf course and perform on the golf course and as a professional, or playing on the soccer pitch with in a big match. So just honing in on anxiety, would you have any sort of little tips and hints related to anxiety, dealing with anxiety for sports people?
Yeah, so slow breathing is something that's pretty obvious, that you can take around 4 to 6 slow breaths and really learn to be able to slow your heart rate down. Obviously, that's only going to be relevant for some situations, but in sports like golf, that kind of thing, where you need to clear your head.
Absolutely. Why 4 to 6, Alice? Is there a bit of science behind that, or was it sort of an estimated amount?
Yeah, that's what I have read. That comes from a book by Kelly McGonigal, where she recommends 4 to 6. I think, if I'm remembering that correctly, and I'm 90% sure that I am. And the idea is that activates your, what they call the prepare and plan mindset. So we have two kind of thinking modes that we could be in. We could be in the fight, flight, freeze mode, where we're really thinking about escaping a current danger, or we can be in the sort of more big picture mode of thinking, where we're thinking more long term, where we're allowing our mind to see a broader perspective, a more flexible perspective, and that's the prepare and plan mindset. So you can get yourself into that mindset with just a few slow breaths. And the idea is that you don't worry about your breath in, but concentrate on your breath out. So you try and lengthen your breath out. So you don't need to worry about breathing deeply. You can mostly worry about breathing slowly, and everything else will kind of take care of itself. So if you imagine breathing slowly, like you're blowing up a balloon, and that you want to sort of get all of that breath, that when you're breathing out, you want to get all of that breath out. You want to get the last kind of little drop of breath out, and then by just focusing on your out breath and doing that slowly, you'll naturally breathe deeper, and your in breath will kind of naturally lengthen. So that's the easiest way to do slow breathing without getting anxious about slow breathing, anxious about whether you're getting it right, or kind of like over breathing. So that's something that people can do.
Which is awesome, by the way. That's gold dust for anybody. Because sorry to interject, but I really need to say that that's something that any coach can do with young players from any sport, whether it's rugby or football, and prepare and plan. So you're taking those breaths before a match. And I'd never really heard of this idea of don't necessarily focus on the inhale, but focus on the exhale. I really like that. Sorry, carry on, Alice. I just wanted to say this is brilliant stuff. Good.
Yeah, I mean, you can even imagine that, like on the rugby field, or those kinds of things where you sort of like or cricket field, where you're standing away from the action, and you just kind of need to get your focus. And maybe if you're thinking more about strategy, if you're in more of like a leadership role within the team, and you need to, maybe you're a few points behind, or whatever it is, and you need, or you're protecting a lead, and you're in that mode of just sort of hang on. Is that you want to sometimes maybe step back and think about your strategy, but when you're in the moment and you're just in that kind of closed-in thinking mode, so people can assess that at the time. Like sometimes it is good just to be in reactive mode, like to utilize that grit. Where if you think a situation just requires grit, maybe you want to stay kind of hyped up. Yep. But if you think that a situation requires sort of some perspective taking, and you need a really shortcut way of putting your brain into that mode where you could think more strategically and more big picture, then kind of that's the way to do it.
And that's something that your fellow countrymen, the Kiwi rugby team, the All Blacks, actually utilise, and they call it red head and blue head. I think they centre mostly on being in that blue head mode. Just each player has a little bit of a trigger that they can utilise during the game to bring them back into the present moment. Because rugby is a game of chaos. There's a lot of chaos thrown at you. There's a lot of sensory input hitting your cortex, hitting your nervous system. And so the capacity to stop, whether it might be take a breath. I think some of them look up to the conversion posts. Some of them will have a cue word or a trigger, and just get into that blue head. So blue sort of representing ice cool, and so they can strategize in the moment, and that's fantastic. And it's exactly like going into the meeting, isn't it? With a boss, or going into a pitch when you're pitching a client, thinking about the world of business here.
Yeah. I mean, these are skills that you can translate to many different domains of life, and that's kind of how you know that they make sense, right? That if it seems like that the strategies would relate to a broad variety of domains of life, like even in terms of like interpersonal relationships, like being able to, if you're in an argument with a spouse or partner, then being able to do that, to go into a bit more of a long-term brain mode that can help you not do things that you find yourself later regretting. whether that's just sort of saying things that you might regret or that type of thing. So yeah, that's one of the ways that you know that these strategies make sense is because when you can see that they would apply to lots of different domains.
So the breathing strikes me as something that hits your physiology, your biology. I'm sure from a cognitive perspective it's quite similar to the self-sabotaging, but within your anxiety book, are there specific cognitive strategies that lessen anxiety that possibly sports people could use?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the things that you mentioned right at the beginning about the Oprah.com article, and that one is focused on rumination. So rumination is when you're overthinking about something that's already happened, and worry is when you're overthinking about something that may happen in the future. So having some skills for dealing with rumination is potentially useful for sports people, where you're feeling regret over situations that you've maybe gotten into, and it is useful to have some strategies for disrupting rumination. So I would say that's kind of useful to have in anyone's toolkit. Across
again, both self-sabotage and anxiety, one of the strategies I really like is the idea of labelling. I've seen some research that suggests you can cool your limbic system, so you can calm your limbic system down just by labelling the emotion that you might be experiencing, such as I'm feeling anxious, I'm being negative here, I'm getting worried, and just that it sounds quite bizarre, but I think it was a psychologist called Baumeister, Roy Baumeister, who did some work on this, and just by labelling the emotion, you can cool the emotion.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it is Baumeister. I mean, Baumeister is a very, very famous psychologist, but I'm not sure that this is his research. And maybe you may absolutely
psychs. Yeah,
you absolutely may be right. Baumeister is one of these rare psychologists who does a lot of different topics rather than sticks within one narrow area. Usually psychologists stick within one very narrow area, but he's known for a bunch of different topics. There's a woman who does more research on this area. But anyway, this is us talking inside baseball probably that no one cares about. But the gist of it is exactly what you say, that when there's lots of research that's showing that just labeling emotions is very helpful for sort of calming, cooling those emotions, and it's even really useful for kids. So you really want to learn the specific emotion words for different feelings, like I feel shame, or I feel anxiety, or I feel worry, or I feel whatever it is, I feel regret, whatever it is that you feel, actually verbalizing what the emotion is just to yourself is incredibly important for just kind of simmering that emotion down a little bit, but also knowing what you should do with the emotion, because all of our emotions have an evolved function. So when you're feeling self-doubt, like it's designed to help you, to prompt you to reflect on what you're doing and to take stock. So self-doubt is a bit like a brake in a car, like the difference between a brake and an accelerator. It kind of puts the brake on a little bit, and that's designed to help stop us doing stupid things. And you can see that if you're feeling some self-doubt, that you want to take a little bit of a step back and assess whether it's a real alarm or a false alarm. So whether it's a real alarm where there's like some sort of nugget of truth to what you might be feeling the doubt about or the worry about, versus whether it's something that's just a false alarm.
This was a brilliant part of your book. I think it was the latest book, but you may correct me, was this idea of you listed all of these emotions, and you gave a succinct explanation as to why we why scientists believe that we experience these emotions. So each of these emotions has a specific reason, and I think that that's really enlightening for people, and especially in sports, especially for coaches, is that, you know, people experience self-doubt and worry and anxiety and anger. Yes, okay, they can be destructive, they can be unhelpful. Actually, we originally, from an evolutionary perspective, we experience them for survival, don't we?
Yeah, they're you know, anything we've evolved to have, like whether it's, you know, thumbs or an emotion, is something that we've generally evolved because the benefits on balance outweigh the negatives for survival, for, you know, keeping us alive and functioning. And of course, for a segment of the population, those emotions kind of tip into a zone that is unhelpful. So if you think almost like a bell curve, where you think that it's good to have a society where you have most people in the middle of where most people experience a moderate amount of anxiety, and then you have people on either end where you have some people who are really bold and don't feel much anxiety, and then you have some people who are really cautious and who are the ones that are saying, hang on, I'm not so sure about this, or there could be some, you know, unexpected negative impact of this. So it's good to have people of all different stripes, rather than seeing any of those things as a flaw. But it is just important to be aware of when your emotions are serving you and when they maybe tip over into something that that's not helpful.
And I really like that term, emotion serving you, because that's very much how they can work in sport. Negative emotions aren't necessarily negative things. You know, anger. You know, when I work with sports people, and funnily enough, if I do a presentation in front of a group of rugby players or a group of footballers, and I say, hands up who plays better when they're angry, you get a lot of hands up, because anger can supercharge your body, can't it? And it can help you to run faster, it can help you to be stronger, more powerful in the moment. And as long as, you know, the way I'll help athletes utilize anger is to direct it towards their skills, rather than direct it on their opponents and get themselves sent off or get themselves into trouble. So it's interesting that, you know, negative emotions, they can be helpful in sport. They're not all bad. And just speaking to you there and listening to what you've got to say, you know, we've evolved to have these negative emotions. They're useful. Just to finish off here, I suppose flipping negativity into something that could be perceived as very positive is this idea of self-compassion. And I know you speak a bit about this in your latest book, and it's something I've touched upon with various guests on the podcast, because it seems so alien to sport, yet I think it's so important, this idea of self-compassion. You know, we live in this tough, fast, dynamic world where there's so much that happens that causes us to worry and doubt ourselves and have anxiety and experience anxiety, and having the ability to be self-compassionate, to like yourself, I think is quite important, isn't it?
Yeah, so when we're too self-critical, it tends to make us avoidant. So it tends to be associated with being avoidant and procrastinating and being too rigid in how we approach things. Whereas if you have more self-compassion, you're able to reflect a bit more usefully about mistakes and things that you've made. So if you're too hard on yourself about a mistake that you've made, you will tend to do less corrective action or less of the kind of helpful corrective actions that you could take. Whereas when you are more understanding with yourself, you'll tend to actually do more to prevent the same mistake happening again. So it's very much like not about just feeling better, but it's about what is the and kind of everything we have talked about, the theme is what's the most useful mindset to take into this situation, and realizing that you want to be flexible about that. So, like, use the sort of great example of feeling anger can be a useful mindset to be in certain situations. But you don't want to then think that the only way to get yourself to do anything is to muster up anger, because that's obviously not going to work in relationships or in other kinds of negotiations, like salary negotiations or things, necessarily. Sometimes it might. So, yeah, you just want to be able to think, what is the best mindset to bring to to a situation it is, and often the best mindset to bring when you've made a mistake or you've got a regret or that kind of thing is to bring a self-compassionate mindset and realize that every single person can relate to making the same mistake that you've made before, and then really kicking yourself about it or that kind of thing, and you sort of want to balance. You really want to create a balance between taking responsibility and blaming other people. So that was something that you mentioned right at the beginning, and people tend to fall on one of those kind of they fall somewhere along that continuum where they'll tend to take too much responsibility for things and not recognize that it wasn't all down to them. Or some people tend to just be very blaming of other people and not see their own role in things. So that's like another instance where you can step back and go, actually, what's the most useful mindset to have about this? Is it more useful to think about my own role, or is it more useful to think about the other factors that went into this too, and that it wasn't all just down to me, that and look on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's so much you've said there over the last 2 minutes that I recognise on a day-to-day basis with young sports people and older sports competitors as well. You use the term avoidant, and self-handicapping and avoidance are so rife in sports, especially aspiring elite competitors who, when they get the opportunity to compete and impress, they often shy away. They can feign an injury, this kind of self-handicap, by going into the medical department and say, I'm not feeling 100% actually, and they're kind of setting themselves up for failure. They're giving their excuse before they've gone to play because they're suffering from that performance anxiety. Some go into the medical department and say, I'm not free to play at all. I can't play. I'm not fit. And it's not that they're not fit, it's just that they're not psychologically ready to play. And that actually stems, it's interesting what you're saying about self-compassion, it stems from not being flexible enough with your thinking. It comes back to the musts and the shoulds, and I have to perform here. It's essential. If I don't, it would be horrendous. It would be catastrophic. And having that ability to, I think, take a step back. It's almost cliche to say it, isn't it, Alice? Just take a step back, take a breath, and think just a bit more flexibly, and just be a bit more self-compassionate. Look, it's okay if I don't perform at my best today, and just focus on the things that you can control, putting in your effort levels, communicating well, playing head up, having great body language. Those are the kind of things I'm talking with players every day, and that must be similar to helping people go into that presentation at work or interview or whatever it might be. Is that notion of control the controllables.
Yeah, and just recognising that we have so much more psychological capacity to cope with things than we think we have. Like, I know this is kind of an extreme example, but you don't see athletes that win silver medals at the Olympics going off and killing themselves because they were so disappointed that they didn't get that gold or whatever it was, because things are difficult. And people will experience, lingering regret and all of those kinds of things. But humans have an amazing ability to cope with emotions, and we cope better than we think we're going to. So you may as well put yourself in a. It's that thing about you miss every shot that you don't take. And so there is always going to be a risk when you try something, but recognizing that you can cope if it doesn't work out, and that you do want to have a little bit of balance as well. That you can, people I think that they, I can't be successful if I don't, I have to give up any semblance of a life or those kinds of things. But you do want to have a bit of a well-rounded self-esteem to help you be able to cope when something happens in an overvalued domain. Like you don't want to just only put all your self-esteem eggs in a single basket.
Yeah, absolutely. Distribute them, as I always like to say. Sports competitors need many shirts, not just their or many jerseys, not just their sports jerseys, but the father, the son, the brother, the mother, the daughter, etc., the friend, the hobbyist. They need many jerseys. It's so important, and that's a fantastic message to finish on. The most important question of the interview here: how can people get hold of your books, which are absolutely brilliant? I've loved over the last couple of weeks. After we got in touch, I've read them. I've made notes. I'm using some of the messages in the books. How can the coaches, the players, the sports parents out there get hold of your books? And are you on social media?
Yeah, so you can get the first chapter of the book free if you sign up to my email list, which is on my website, and I'm sure that you'll put the link to it. It's just aliceboyes.com. Boys is BOYES.com. So when you sign up to my email list, you'll get blog articles when I write them, and you'll also get the first chapter of the book free. And I'm on Twitter at Dr. Alice Boyes. And you can get the books all the usual places. So Amazon, the Book Depository is a really great place for people who are the US and in a variety of countries to get them. So I'm obviously from New Zealand. So if you're from New Zealand or Australia, you can get free shipping on the books from Book Depository, or places that you buy books.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Alice Boyes. Everyone, wasn't that fantastic? I really enjoyed that, and I'm on a mission to interview lots of mainstream psychologists away from sports psychology, and other people who might not necessarily play sport or be invested in sport as such. Because I just think that's so important for us in our industry to grow. There is so much there that Alice has written in her books and tweets about every day and writes about, and we spoke about there, that is, well, everything's relevant to sports. Everything is relevant because sport is psychosocial, it's driven by psychosocial, and we all need to be better in that area. Now, if you enjoyed that as much as I did, please do leave a review. And don't forget, you can subscribe to the Sports Psych Show to receive updates. I hope you can join me next week. I've got more fantastic guests coming up in the coming weeks. Goodbye for now.